Right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. The Regeneron Science Talent Search application season is now open, and we are so excited to kick off our annual webinar series tonight by talking with all of you. I'm Allie Stiefel. I'm the director of the Science Talent Search. I've been the director of the competition for 7 or 8 cycles at this point, and I've been at Society for Science for 13 years. I'm joined today by Elaine Edwards, who will introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Elaine Edwards, and I am the Senior Specialist for the Regeneron Science Talent Search. I've been at the Society for a little over 5 years at this point, and it's always a treat to welcome new students into the process. So thank you so much for being with us here today. Very excited to go through our rules overview, give you some of our favorite tips, just for avoiding some pitfalls and making sure that you are putting your best foot forward with your application.
That's exactly right. Now, you probably already know that the Regeneron Science Talent Search is the nation's oldest and most prestigious research competition for high school seniors. And we're really glad you're here. You're here to learn more information and really do your best on that application, which, of course, is open now through November 7th, 2024 at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. You're going to hear us reiterate that a lot this program cycle, maybe even more than usual. And that's because it's a few days after the presidential election. We will not be moving this deadline, but we look forward to receiving yours, I'm sure well ahead of that anyways. So today we're going to talk about everybody's favorite topic, rules, and how to make sure that your entry is in adherence to our rules and does not fail to qualify, which is actually easier than you think. So we want to make sure that you're keeping yourself, your research subjects safe, and we want to make sure all entrants are really eligible and maintain a fair playing field. That's why we have rules, and that's why we monitor them and update them year to year. We'll also talk about the importance of giving credit to the adults who support you with your research, and crediting your images and more. So if you're looking for more resources about the application, like what is Regeneron STS, even more application tips, maybe from people who've been through the process before, we encourage you to check out our website, which is very robust, probably answers most questions that you have. You can find a lot of past webinars. I think we have 15 or 20 recorded sessions on various topics at this point. Most are still relevant year to year, despite perhaps like the application deadline. Most of that information is going to be relevant year to year. We have a robust FAQ page, both on the main website and on the application website, and more. So in this session, we are going to provide a tour of our rules book, which is one of the our excellent resources that we recommend all entrants read, or all supportive adults of entrants read every year. And then we will also answer your questions. Please feel free to drop questions in the chat. We hope that we're answering, most of the frequently asked questions along the way during tonight's session. But if you do have any questions, please feel free to leave them there. And if we don't get to your question tonight, please email us. We're always open to answering questions at sts@societyforscience.org, and we'll drop that the email address you'll see later on in this presentation. Last but not least, I just want to say, Elaine and I are here. We're taking the time tonight, like after work hours, to speak to all of you because it's really important to us that students have the correct information. It's easy to go to Reddit or Discord and listen to the trolls, right? Fellow 17-year-olds who think they know the answer. But the truth is, we see a lot of misinformation. And so we're here to make sure you're getting the right information. You can trust Elaine and I. We create the application, the rubrics, we design this whole ship. And so you're getting information straight from the source.
All right, so like Allie said, for the bulk of this presentation, we are going to spend some time going through our rules book. This is a great resource for all entrants and supportive adults, and we are going to show you why, first with a little tour. We're going to go straight through it, show you all the important sections. Then we're actually going to go a little more in depth and talk to you about the actual rules. One thing to get out of the way is that we do know this is a very dense document. It's long. But we do recommend that entrants, teachers, and mentors review this annually, and here is why. One is that the STS rules differ from ISEF rules. So if you're familiar with our sister competition, the International Science and Engineering Fair, important to keep an eye out that these competitions are slightly different. And this is particularly true when it comes to eligibility and any research involving animals. But we'll get into all of that in a second. Another reason it's good to review this every year is because the rules change and are updated every year. And we're going to make sure to highlight some of those top changes later as well. Also good to know is that our rules do supersede the rules of any other contest or your lab. These could have looser or different requirements. And our rules for what's exempt or not requiring pre-approval are pretty hard and fast. So you definitely need to make sure that our rules are more important than those of any other competition or lab that you are doing your research as part of. The rules book does also set the tone on our ethics statement, and this really helps you understand what you're getting into with our competition. Not just the seriousness of the program, but also the big prizes and opportunities that await you too. You can also find this rules book linked in many places. One is on our Regeneron STS homepage. We'll give you the link for that. We'll pop that into the chat at the end of the presentation, as well as on the application site FAQ and within the application itself in multiple places. So you have plenty of access to it, but let's go ahead and get into it right now.
All right, so you'll know you're in the right place if you see a document that looks like this. Like Elaine said, we're gonna just kind of scroll through this and talk to you about what you can find in each section and why it's helpful. And we'll go kind of more in depth into some of these sections later on. So never fear if you think we've glazed over something, we'll get to it, we promise. The first page I want to point out to you is this nifty little checklist page right on page 2. Print this. We love this page. This is a nice little guide to help you digest the content of what you need to do for your application. It's also a reminder for you, depending on the type of research that you're doing, that you might need to gather certain types of paperwork and certain types of letters of recommendation, that sort of thing. So do take a look at this page and print it, put it near your computer. That's what I would do. All right, on the next page to point out, if you don't know a lot about STS, check out this page. In addition to our full website, this tells you about the accolades of many of our alumni. This also tells you kind of how the program works as we narrow down entrants to top 300 scholars to top 40 finalists. And just by participating, you're really joining a group of special young leaders in STEM going back over 80 years. Another page I would print, important dates. This tells you when the application opens, when it closes, our technical support deadline, which is 24 hours before the real deadline. Print this and familiarize yourself with it. The other thing to know is that recommendations from adults, you'll need 3 types of recommendations. More about that in that section. They're due the same time as the application. So, adults are pretty busy. Our number one tip really at this stage is go ahead and request your recommendation from any recommender that you think you're going to make a request from. Even if your research is not finished, there's a lot, they can get a head start. You really don't need to have finished the semester or quarter or whatever for someone to fill that out for you. Anyway, important dates. Next, eligibility. You're going to want to make sure you review the basic requirements, review this carefully. Most questions that we get in our inbox at this stage in the year are about eligibility. Some of this changes year to year, so do check that out. Next section, and this is all that. We'll scroll right through. I want to point out here our ethics statement. The ethics statement is something that every entrant will need to agree to in order to submit their application. In our system, you'll see that you'll have to check to attest to every box. We include this here in the rules book because we want to put this up front and center. This has been here in our rules book up front and center for many, many years. It's very important to us. You want to make sure that you really can attest to all of these things, right? You did your own research. You are giving credit and disclosing adult support. Being honest about what the contents are in your application. This is verifying that, so please do review it. The next section we would definitely recommend you read is how this little primer we added this year about how to make the most of your application. We wanted to make sure that this was easily findable for all entrants to this competition. These really are our top tips for students. It's full of tips. We're not going to go over them all now, but rest assured a savvy applicant would review this and really gives you kind of a heads up. So we really recommend that you check that out. This section outlines the rules the rules, this is all the rules, outlines the awards. That's more fun, right? It outlines the awards that a student could win and what goes along with that. This also talks about some of the conditions of the awards, which might be of interest to some students. Moving on down, page 14 is super important. It talks more about academic integrity. It gives you our intellectual property policy. A lot of questions we get in the inbox also at this stage about students who aren't sure if they can or should enter are something like, does this society or Regeneron own my intellectual property if I enter STS? The answer to that is no. And then there are some nuances in here that you might want to read that might be of interest to your group. So please check that out. Also, we've always had here this section about grievances. If you're ever curious how to report a grievance to the society, there's information here and on our scientific integrity page on our website. All right, then the book shifts and we get into heavy science, the rules of scientific research. They're broken up by first human research and then animal research. Within each of those sections, there are sections about cell lines and tissue. And then we have PHBAs and hazardous materials. All of that we're going to get into separately in a minute. And it might not all apply to you. None of it could apply to you, but some of it might apply and you don't realize it. So we recommend you at least tune into the human section just to be super, super sure that what you're doing is not something we qualify as human research, because a lot of kids are surprised, and that's how sometimes you get disqualified. So we want to make sure we're all on the same page there about what you need. Let's see. So we'll scroll past this, but know that we are going to talk about it. The other thing I'll say as I'm scrolling, because it's many, many pages, this information can be overwhelming because it's a lot. And so really the best way that we recommend to review this material, please read it. But if you're still like unclear, like, oh, this is what am I supposed to really do? Go to task 3 in the application, and the logic there will kind of guide you to what forms you need. So we recommend kind of that as the end stop there. Okay. The next thing to point out, just this Appendix 1 that shows you the categories of entry for STS. So unlike ISEF, if you're familiar with our sister competition, the International Science and Engineering Fair, also sponsored by Regeneron, unlike ISEF, students do not win awards within a category for STS. So you might think like, well, why do you have them? You do select a category so that we can assign appropriate scientists to review your work. So here, this is also linked in the application in the question where we ask you to pick a category, but we also have it here for reference, and this shows you kind of what the subcategories are or what we mean by certain categories. So do check that out. Then Appendix 2, your research report guidelines. Every entrant to this competition will submit a 20-page research paper. There are some rules around that, so you'll want to check them out just to make sure your entry is in adherence to those rules. All right, Appendix 3 just gives you information on those recommendations that I mentioned. Every entrant must request 3 types of recommendations and can request 2 of each type for 2 of the types of recommendations. And if that sounds confusing, there's more information on our website, and this document outlines it pretty clearly for you. And then in addition to that, we have instructional sheets and copies of all the questions that are asked of your recommenders. We want to make sure that students can see that content and you know what they're being asked, because you're not going to be able to see their answers. This at least helps with that. However, it's also important to know, like, if you wanted to like email this to your recommender and let them look, let them see the questions, they actually have to submit their answers in our form, in our online system after you invite them. So that's super important. This is really just for transparency. Okie doke. Appendix 7, I think, is pretty helpful, especially maybe if you're an educator, you want a snapshot of like what might my students need in terms of like pre-approvals and paperwork. We still recommend reviewing the full animal-human PHBA rules, but this is kind of a summary that tells you like what they might need. And so we hope that you find that page to be helpful. The next couple of appendices are around institutional review boards. So depending on what you're trying to do with humans, you most likely are going to need approval from an institutional review board or an IRB. You're going to need approval from an IRB that's based at the institution that basically has the most oversight over the population you're studying. For most or a lot of projects, that's pretty easy. Those are already formed, like at a hospital or university. They're pretty like systematic in what you have to do. But sometimes, like say you want to do a project at your school with fellow students as your research subjects, your school can form an IRB if they don't already have one, and some schools do, some don't. It's not really hard. It's not very hard. So we have this primer here that if you want to do a project, or you're a teacher and like your school doesn't have an IRB, like you can form one pretty easily. Take this appendix and read it, and this gives you all the steps that you need. It also has a sample form for students to fill out. So we recommend that you do that to create more access for students to do research at your school. And sometimes the school isn't allowed to, but like the local science fair can, or the school district has one for all the schools. But anyways, instructions for kind of those circumstances. All right, Appendix 12 is linked a bunch of places on our website because, again, we want to help you avoid pitfalls. But this is a list of common reasons that projects failed to qualify last year. That's what we say instead of saying that you were disqualified. We say that you failed to qualify because of a failure of action taken on someone's part. So don't fall in that category. We want to make sure you're successful in this process. So do take a look. And know this is not necessarily, it's pretty comprehensive, but the fun in this, it's not really fun, is that new reasons are added to this list every year. So take this with a grain of salt, but it is pretty thorough. All right, and that's it. That's the rules book. So we are going to now go into kind of more in depth those sections, and yeah, Elaine, take it away.
Awesome. All right. So now you know basically everything that you need to know in the rules book, but we are going to go through and summarize some of the bigger highlights and give you pointers that'll make sure your application stays clean and eligible. So to kick it right off, we're going to talk a little bit about the basic eligibility requirements. Right here on the screen, you will see all of those, but we'll go through them real quick. One is that in order to apply to Regeneron STS, students must be living and attending school in the United States, or you can be a U.S. citizen living abroad. We've definitely received more inquiries than usual about that rule this year. We don't have plans to turn STS into an international competition, but we do encourage students who don't meet the eligibility requirements for Regeneron STS to definitely look into that sister competition we mentioned earlier, Regeneron ISEF, which is open to high school students across the globe. So definitely feel free to visit our website and check that one out as well. Also important to note here is that entrants must be in their final year of high school and must not have yet graduated. So another one that we receive a lot of inquiries about, we know that there can be some odd circumstances, like maybe you're graduating early. Essentially, if you might graduate this year, but you're still not quite sure, maybe you're waiting on admission to a special program, waiting on credits, that kind of thing, you can apply, but you're going to need to give us final determination by December 15th of this year. That's when you let us know, yes, I'm graduating, I'm eligible, and feel free to proceed, or not so much, and we'll withdraw your application. Also important to know here is that students may only submit individual research to this competition. There are no team projects allowed, and also no separating previous teamwork or rejoining teamwork for use after STS. And more information on that is available in our rules book. Finally, entrants must have some kind of research project that is pretty much the center of your application. But important to note that it can't just be an idea. It has to be a completed project with some results to analyze. It can't be a literature review, anything along those lines. It's got to be an independent scientific investigation, and you've got to have enough data to be able to talk about it. So those are eligibility basics.
Great. Now we want to talk about kind of a theme that you'll see throughout our application, which is disclosing support and conflicts of interest. So the main thing, as you see on the slide, is when in doubt, always be honest when answering these questions, but I want to give you some context about why we're asking about that. Oh, sorry. Great. So many of the rules in this section, the eligibility section of our rules book, are around disclosure by entrants and by recommenders of all support that's been received and provided to the student. You might wonder, why does this matter? Why do you care? And what exactly do I need to share to make sure everything is on the up and up? So we require disclosure of any entrant participation in paid research programs, paid application support, any other type of financial transaction around the application or the research project. And this helps us to establish important context about, one, the level of help received, your contribution to the work compared to other students or other programs, how you spend your time, right? It also helps us to monitor paid programs and make sure that they are not taking advantage of students. So sometimes we see discrepancies in what a student is saying versus what a mentor is saying. And we always want to make sure that students are being treated right. And this is one way to do that. Now we know that most paid programs are on the up and up and are doing a nice job. We don't disallow them at all. We do not discriminate against them, but we do collect a little more information for some of those reasons. However, we do just want to say in the session, if you are aware of any paid programs, really any research program for students that you feel like is predatory or taking advantage of a student in any way, we hope that you would report that, or you need to report that to the society. You can email our team at sts@societyforscience.org, and we are happy to there's a form we'll have you fill out, and we'll go from there. But to avoid such kind of programs from happening, or to avoid selecting a program that might be predatory, there are a few tips that we'll share with you here. If it were me and I was looking for a research program and willing to pay, I would make sure that there's transparent information on their website, that the names of the people leading the program are publicly available, and staff as well. I would make sure that pricing is transparent. So those are just a couple of red flags that I would look out for when choosing really any kind of program. And I do want to say this is a very small number of entries. It's usually way less than even 10% of our entrants participate in a paid research program, and that carries through all the way up. So it's consistent, it's not overrepresented, but we just have our eye on making sure everybody has a safe and positive research experience. So we also require entrants to disclose if any direct relatives work in STEM fields, if their family has any personal connection, like whatsoever, to their mentor, and any level of adult support whatsoever with the project or application. It makes total sense, right, that students who are interested in STEM and who are applying to STS might come from families that have a lot of STEM careers and are STEM oriented. That's awesome. That's how you were inspired to do research. That's fantastic. But it is helpful for us to know, right? So then when we do our plagiarism check, you match similar work to, a relative of yours, then there's at least an explanation for it, right? And that no one was trying to hide anything. Also want to make sure that if it comes out that your mentor works for one of your parents, that there's not that could be perceived as a conflict of interest if not reported, that there's a power dynamic there that is uncomfortable for people. So these are some of the reasons we want to make sure this is all disclosed and out in the open for us to be aware of. This helps to just establish a level of trust and understanding in our application process, and of any influence and like how the project came to be. When this information is hidden, it can create distrust around student contribution, and any recommendations from these individuals become a little bit less believable. And so the best policy here really is just to be honest. You're not discriminated against for having family relatives in STEM. And so we just want to make sure, again, that everything is clean. We know interns receive a lot of help. That's how science works. It's cumulative. People help each other. And it's almost weird if you don't have any outside or adult help, right? Like we get a lot of students who claim that they did it all on their own, and perhaps a lot of it was, but so there's often an influence there that we want to make sure that you're crediting. So if we find discrepancies in information between students and adults, or that information has been discounted or hidden, this is grounds to disqualify an entry. We want to avoid that.
Awesome. So now that we have covered that, we're going to go through the rules of research that we kind of skimmed through earlier in our rules book, but go way more into depth on each of those sections. So as we noted, what we're about to share is not going to apply to everyone. You might not have done anything with animals. You might not have done anything with humans. That's totally fine, but definitely, as Ali said, pay attention to this human research section that we'll go through first, just to make sure your project absolutely doesn't involve humans in any way. We also want to say that it might seem overwhelming in general, having all of this presented this way. So what we really do recommend, as we said earlier, open task 3 in your application. If you enter the details of your project, the form will actually guide you toward the documentation that you need to provide. So that's really going to be the easiest way to know exactly what you need. All right. So as we mentioned, every entrant should read this section of the rules book. We do mean that basically any project that involved humans in any way counts as a human project. And the reason that this can trip some folks up is because there are a lot of ways that human data might be part of your project that you don't necessarily think about because you didn't survey someone specifically, or you didn't test something on a human. So surveys, testing of computer software, reviewing human data from a public database, taking photos of humans and using them to train an algorithm. Those are just a few examples of human research that would require you to check that box in task 3. Important, though, to note is that this doesn't necessarily mean that you need to demonstrate pre-approval in all of these cases. So task 3 is going to use that if-then logic to help you determine what paperwork you really do need to submit, and we'll give you a little overview here as well. So many types of human projects, but not all, are going to require pre-approval from something called an institutional review board, or an IRB. The IRB will review your project plan to learn what you're planning to do with or to humans, and they might require you to collect something called informed consent or even appearance release forms, just depending on your project. They might suggest changes to your methodology. And finally, they're going to sign documentation indicating if they approve the project and or if they do recommend changes, in which case you would need to go through that approval process again. The IRB should be constituted of at least 3 adults, and you can see Appendix 8 in our rules book for more info on who those folks should be. You also, as Ali mentioned earlier, do need to get approval from the IRB that best represents the population that you're studying. So hospital patients should have approval from a hospital. A school IRB can approve a project that you're doing at the school. It needs to match up there in order to be valid. You're also going to be asked to provide any approval paperwork to us in the application. And very important to make sure that it is signed by the IRB and dated to demonstrate that your project was approved before it began. We're also going to need to see that they're approving this specific project that you're submitting. We've had some schools try to provide summary forms that aren't really acceptable because they don't really show us anything specific to the project. All right, so those are all the forms that might require IRB pre-approval, but there are some human studies that are exempt, so they don't require that pre-approval. Some of those, just to run through really quickly, are observational studies. That's where you're not changing anything in the environment, not adding new stimuli, introducing new food, that kind of thing, purely looking at humans and not doing anything to them. Also the use of only the student researcher in the study. So you are the only human participant, you as the applicant, and nobody else was involved. Also studies involving cadavers and surveys that are not the student's own design. Though also important there is that permission is going to be needed to utilize the survey if it's not in the public domain. And any study that requires a human to do anything, again, like that's take a photo, jump, answer questions, that's going to be something that requires permission. So just keep that in mind when reading through that list of exemptions. We talked earlier about data and how that can trip some students up. Projects that just use data are exempt in many circumstances. Some of those might be if the data is publicly available, you'll still need to provide a reference for that. If the data is provided to a student from a mentor or from their published study, and same situation, you'll need a reference there as well. If the data provided to the student is not publicly available, the student is going to need to provide IRB approval for the mentor or sources study. So in some cases, a letter is going to be okay from that mentor, demonstrating a chain of command, basically who gave you permission to use this data and be involved. But for more information on all of that, see task 3. And if you are using data of any kind, any that is used or provided to you as the student must be de-identified prior to it being given to you. All right, so I know that was a ton of information, but some last ones to run through really quick, just important to keep in mind are that entrants may not give prescription drugs to humans. That's a big important one for us. Entrants are also not permitted to diagnose or publish apps or services that definitively diagnose disease. And finally, entrants may not perform medical procedures. So again, on all of that, we know it's a lot of information, but definitely read that rules book in full, visit task 3, and you'll find out what you need in no time.
Great. Let's move on to talking about the animals. Specifically, we're talking about vertebrate animals here. You really can do anything per our rules with inverts. But for vertebrate animals, the rules are a bit more defined, or a lot more defined, I should say. There are very limited circumstances where entrants are allowed to work with live vertebrate animals. We'll talk about cell lines and tissue here in a few minutes. That's more common, to be honest, than working with live animals in this program, but here are the circumstances. 1, all studies involving live vertebrate animals must be conducted at a registered research institution or an RRI. You can look to see if your institution is an RRI. At most universities or like government labs would be acceptable. But that is important to have that verification. Live animals may only be handled by student researchers for husbandry purposes. What does that mean? That means the typical care for that animal in captivity. So feeding them their normal food, though, not any changed food. You're not experimenting on that. We're not introducing new stimuli. It means normal cleaning of their cages or enclosures, normal medical monitoring, right? So no new stimuli, basic husbandry care. And the entrant may not cause any pain or distress to an animal. This includes studies where animals are starved or exhibit weight loss. That is a sign of stress in vertebrate animals. So you're going to make sure that your studies are not doing any of those things. Now, there are 2 circumstances where a student may work with live vertebrate animals outside of an RRI, and those are as follows. 1, the entrant can do these are observational studies, right? It's like you go out in nature, you're going to count how many birds you see in the sky at 10 a.m. every day or whatever it is, right? You go outside, you're observing, you're counting, you're that kind of thing. As long as you are not introducing new stimuli, that counts as an observational study and is exempt from any kind of pre-approval or documentation. So like an example where this would not be exempt is if you go out into nature and you plop a log on the ground. You want to see what happens. How did the animals react? Well, you've just introduced a new stimuli. You've introduced a new habitat. Like you did something. So that does not count. And so, yeah, so if it's purely observational, you're good. The other circumstance where you don't need to work at an RRI is if you perform studies that involve wildlife monitoring under a permit. So what this basically means, again, mostly like observational counting, but maybe you have to handle the animal. Maybe you have to handle eels to get them out of a trap, to count them and release them back into the water like immediately. If this is done under a wildlife permit for a larger study, that's totally allowed. We just need to see the permit, or sometimes it is an IACUC that is approving that study. So that's what we'll need to see. The other big thing is that animals may not be sacrificed for the student's study. This means that students are only supposed to be using byproduct of another study when we're talking about like cell lines, tissue, organoids, that kind of thing. The mentor is going to have to clarify that for sure this animal was not killed for the student's research. The student also must not design the study before the animal is sacrificed. This can be a blurry line, and so I'll give you an example. The student designs a study that requires the mentor to like poison a mouse to see how kidneys are impacted. The student designs it. The mentor sacrifices the mouse and gives the student the kidneys. This is not allowed. The student has designed an action that was performed on the live animal before it was deceased. The student designed the study that led to the sacrifice. That is not permitted per STS rules. Now, here's where, it's a little bit confusing sometimes. Say the mentor is already doing they're looking at, I don't know, name another organ. But you want to look at the kidneys because, hey, they're looking at, they have byproduct, right? You in that case would be welcome to. You're going to need documentation from the mentor's study showing, they had designed this study and you're using the byproduct. And so that's the kind of verification where your mentor, it's really important and helpful that we hear from them to verify that. All right, that's about animals.
Great. So for this next section, we are going to lump human and animal cells together, just for ease, since our rules are pretty similar here. But in the application, please do be sure to differentiate and clearly outline for us what specific cell lines you were using. You've heard this before, but essentially some cell lines are going to be exempt from pre-approvals and others are not be. So going to run through some examples here of the types of cell lines or tissues that don't require any pre-approval. That could be items purchased from a catalog or a public source like the ATCC. It could be cell lines, tissues, blood, breast milk, and so on, obtained from a certified and public source like a blood bank or a library. It could be cells provided by a mentor that were part of a published study. It could again be use of only you as the student researcher, only your cells. Use of found materials like feathers. And in all of these scenarios, you would still need to provide some sort of documentation. So maybe that would be a receipt for a cell line you purchased, or a link to the study in the case it was part of your mentor's published study. These materials also often count as PHBAs, which we'll talk a little bit about next. So you would probably need a risk assessment form, just a heads up there. And we'll talk a little bit more about that soon. But there are also, of course, cases where we are going to need to see some pre-approval. And you would need to provide this to us in the application. And so that would be cases where the cells are provided to the student by a mentor from an unpublished study. In that case, we would need to see the original IRB or IACUC for that original study. Important to say that that's very common. Sometimes the mentor does want to give us a renewal form, say if the study has been ongoing for a long period of time. That's fine, but just keep in mind that we do need to see the original dates of the study. That trips some folks up. So definitely make sure to give us those original dates. Also, a case where you would need pre-approval is a situation where the student designed the experiment where the cell lines themselves were collected.
Awesome. The next section, potentially hazardous biological materials. So if you are working with mold, bacteria, pathogens, you need to be aware of the rules in this section. This includes any project where E. coli is involved, even as a food source. That's another thing that trips students up. They'll say, I worked with C. elegans. You're like, but what did you feed them? So know that kind of all those sub materials also count here, because again, this is about keeping you safe and other people around you safe too. So all of these types of projects are prohibited to do in a home environment. Like, you can do them in the right environment, but home is never going to be one of them. And that's because when you culture bacteria, we want to make sure that it's being disposed of properly and that you're not spreading that to places that shouldn't get spread. So you want to make sure that instead of your home, you're working in the appropriate level biosafety lab. What you're going to do is you're going to Google your bacteria and you're going to find out the BSL level of said bacteria. And then you're going to make sure the lab you're working in, often if they've obtained it for you, then they have that level of safety, but you're going to make sure that there's a match there. Most high schools are BSL 1, so they're equipped to handle a lot of the organisms that STS entrants tend to work with, but there are usually a handful of entrants who are working with BSL 2 level organisms, which is often going to be a university lab or an RRI, so you'll just want to make sure that that all checks out. Other big ones, students may not handle prions or really work with them at all. This is a new ISEF rule from last year and now this year for STS. It's just they've been deemed so dangerous that we just don't want students working with them. The other thing here, we've discussed prescription drugs a couple of times here as well, but we just want to be clear that in addition to the other rules mentioned, any use of prescription drugs on projects of any type, human, animal, plant, they must demonstrate a chain of command. Like, how did you obtain them? And if you worked in an RRI, usually, that's pretty easy. But we want to make sure you have that original prescription if that's something that you obtained elsewhere. All of these types of projects require the use of a risk assessment form, which you will need to have an adult review and sign ahead of experimentation. Again, the type of document that needs to be signed and dated before you get started on your project.
Great. So now that we've gone through all of those a little more in depth, here are a few ways that we recommend you avoid being disqualified based on the rules. One tip for you is that any paperwork we require, depending on the nature of your project, must be signed and dated. Dates really need to demonstrate that the project was approved before implementation, and the paperwork itself should demonstrate exactly what was approved. So the more specific, the better. Under some circumstances, alternate documentation is going to be accepted, but again, take a look at task 3. We have information there about what exactly you will need to submit instead. Important, and I don't think we've touched on yet in this presentation, is that external links are not permitted anywhere in the application except where asked for and except in your bibliography. Evaluators and judges cannot click on them to learn more about your work. That's a very strict rule for us, so definitely recommend avoiding that. Some other easy ways to end up in trouble is, we'll just run through the quick list, is lying. Your images are not credited. You get a plagiarism match. You fake a reference or a recommendation. You attempt to hide teamwork, or adult involvement isn't properly disclosed. You lie about how much you paid to attend a certain program, or your mentor lies. So in general, just be honest. Another one that we definitely don't want folks to get tripped up on, especially now that it is a lot more popular, just please don't use ChatGPT or AI. If you're using it as part of your project and that is disclosed, that's totally fine. But our rules on that are very strict. Don't use it to craft responses in the application, for example. Just avoid it. We want to see your own work. As you can probably tell from this presentation and all of the information here, we at the Society for Science take scientific integrity very seriously. We always have, and none of this is new. One thing that is new is the scientific integrity page on our website. This just provides a great outline of our policies all in one place, so that it's easy to find. Also lets you know what your responsibilities are as a student researcher in our competitions. We also hope that it helps make it a little clearer. If you need to report a concern about an entrant or a suspicious program, you're going to be able to find that information both on that page and in our rules book. Important to note there is that the society does not and has not ever considered anonymous complaints. This is because the context of things like the complainant's identity is really essential to a fair investigation. But we do our best to protect whistleblowers. And that's just to make sure that everyone in the course of an investigation like that is protected and is given a fair standing. So definitely visit those pages for more information there.
All right, now we're going to give you a couple of tips and tricks. And we know this presentation was very rules heavy. That was our intent. It had been a while since we've given a rules heavy presentation, and just it always breaks our heart a little bit when we have to disqualify a project for a reason that could have been avoided. So that's why we wanted to do this. But please know that some of our future webinars are going to be a lot more fun and how to do well in this process. So we couldn't end this without giving you some of those tips here today. So with that, what are things you can do to make your application stand out and also avoid these pitfalls? So many things. First and foremost, which may not be clear from this presentation, but STS is not all about the research. It's not just about the research. And in fact, our goal with this program is to identify future leaders in STEM, and it's a holistic review. That's why our application is long. We care about your research. You have to have a great project, but we also care about the holistic review of the student. What do you care about? How do you spend your time? How are you a leader in your various communities? We hope that this shines through for you because we really look at the whole student. So here are my top tips and tricks after literally, I think I read almost every application each year. It feels like that. What I would do, one, make a thesis statement before you start. Who are you? What do you care about? What are the things you really want to come through in that application? And then as you fill out the questions, you can always refer back to that just to make sure that like those central themes shine through within your application. Then, because we're looking for leaders in STEM, you're going to want to make sure you tell us, how are you a leader? Maybe you are a leader in your lab. Maybe you have self-led yourself through this research project. Maybe you are a leader in your religious community, your home life, your soccer team. These are all skills, right? Depending on life circumstance that are the chances you've had to be a leader. So please highlight those. Then tell us your circumstances. We hope that you're going to be honest with us about your unique experience. Did you work in a fancy lab? Did you not have a lab near you? We don't need a sob story, but we want you to be honest about how you find yourself in the life that you have now. We also recommend that you just try. Every single year, nearly every top 40 finalist tells us that they were shocked to be named a finalist and that they almost didn't apply. And so don't let that be you, just go for it. We also recommend you start now. The application is long. You guys are busy senior year. Oh my goodness. And a lot of distractions, especially in like a presidential election year cycle, in the news and with feelings and all of that. So I would recommend starting now. Like maybe you'll surprise yourself and just get her done. Work in small chunks. Working in small periods of time will also make this feel less overwhelming. If you have not yet opened an application, please do. Then you're going to get an automatic response within like a couple hours that gives you some tips on like how to knock out like 30% of the application in an hour or two. So check that out because that really does help make it feel a little bit better. You're going to request those letters of recommendation now. Help those adults make sure that they get those in time for you. We know they want to support you, but sometimes they get busy too, so just make sure you give them plenty of time. And then that's pretty much it. So yeah, set little goals for yourself, and we know you'll be there in no time.
Great. So we could not end our presentation without sharing some resources with you, what we like to do at the end of all our webinars. We have a resource page on our application website, and this is full of links to things like past webinars, to a tour of the application. It has one-page guides and other important information from the rules book. Definitely make sure to check that out. It's got all the things you need all in one place. We also on that application website have an FAQ. So this is our most commonly asked questions. We update it every year with new questions or things that we're getting more and more often, just to make sure everyone has access to the same information. Our favorite tip with that, we know it's long and you might be looking for something specific. Use Control F, use that find function to search keywords for what you're looking for. It makes it a lot easier. But definitely, if you do have questions, you can contact us at our email. That's sts@societyforscience.org. That's also true for your recommenders. We have an FAQ specific to them, especially specific to their system, which looks a little different. If they still need help after viewing that page, they can also shoot us an email at sts@societyforscience.org. We want to make sure that everyone has all of the information they need to succeed, and we're here to help. That's what Allie and I do every day, and that's what we're excited to help. We're excited to help you put your best foot forward. All right, Allie, do you want to go through some questions?
Sure, I see them here. I think a few may have disappeared. I saw one earlier that maybe was deleted. So if you still have questions, feel free to post them. We'll start with this first one that I see anyway. What would a systematic review research project be eligible for this competition? Unfortunately, the answer to that is no. We do request that you're submitting original research to Regeneron STS. We know there are other programs out there for those types of papers, but it's not too late to do an original research project. I know sometimes you say that and people are like, you're crazy. But a lot of STS finalists are able to do their research in just a couple of weeks, really depending on the topic, and still be quite competitive. So don't let that hold you back if this is something that you're interested in. Great. Who are the judges and how were they chosen for both the scholar and finalist level? So we don't disclose the names of our judges publicly, except sometimes the chair of the panel makes a public statement. And the reason for this is just we want them to have their anonymity and their peace, and the group can change from year to year. But what I can share is that they are all PhD scientists. So every receives at least 3 reads from a PhD scientist. They represent all 50 states. Every discipline that you see, we recruit new folks every year to accommodate new expertise that comes around, or that's needed. The thing that is unique to us in some ways in our review process compared to maybe other programs like ISEF judging, well, the programs are quite different, which if you're familiar with ISEF, I think you can see. But for us, you're assigned those initial 3 we call evaluators. And then if any one of them reads your entry and says, you know what, I don't get it. This is not my expertise. Like, I'm a water chemistry person and this is birds. I don't know. I'm, making it up. They'll say like, would you mind reassigning this? And we'll reassign it to a more appropriate person who's comfortable reading it. But sometimes the person might be able to read it and then they'll say, I think this is great, but I have a question about this. Could you toss it to a 4th reader or a 5th reader? So it's super common in our process for applications to get read between 4 and 7 times. Really, it seems to be more of the average these days. And so we do share that with entrants, often in the context of like, I don't know what category to select. And we're like, well, do your best of thinking about what kind of scientists would be best to read your paper, but also don't fret too much, because if they decide that they can't do it, or you need 3 other kinds of scientists from 3 different disciplines to read it, we make sure that they do, so that every entry gets a fair shot. So I hope that's helpful. And then the judges, it's the same group of 18 judges who select the 40 finalists, as who also interviews and meets with them in March to determine the top 10 winners. Great. And then Elaine, do you want to answer the next question from Nish Fish?
Sure, I can. Thanks for being here, Nish Fish. You've asked how many applicants are there usually each year from which the 300 scholars are chosen? So we tend to get around 2,000 applications every year. That number has continued to grow. We hope it will continue to grow as well as it reaches more folks. But definitely pretty stiff competition. And at the same time, if you do the math, you stand a pretty good chance of being named a 300 scholar if you just apply. So we always, as we said earlier, meet finalists who didn't think they stood a chance. So definitely worth just throwing your hat in the ring and giving yourself a chance and not counting yourself out before you've done so.
Totally. All right. From James, the next question. Are continuation projects weighted differently than projects that aren't? It's a great question to want to know more about continuation projects. So another way that ISEF and STS are different are eligibility around kind of continuation projects. So for ISEF, the rule is a student can submit research conducted in a 12-month period within an 18-month period, right? And then you can do a continuation project, but you have to be clear about what you did each year. For STS, you can submit research that you did any year of high school over any length of time. So if you felt like your freshman year project you spent 2 weeks on, and you have one, and that's what you want to enter, awesome. I've seen those projects make the top 40. If you have a project you've spent 5 years on, well, wow, that really shows your dedication, right? And so it's impressive. But also, the judges don't discount at all that a student might do, I mentioned a 6-week project, but they are using skills they have learned over 6 years, right? And so those are both things that are admirable. And so one is not weighted more than another. We really see both do quite well. I would say probably an equal increment for STS. So I hope that is helpful that, yes, that is a valuable thing for sure. All right. And Karen B, I hope we also just answered your question that you can use research from previous years. That is totally fine and super common. That's pretty common. SGAD, if research involved humans, who's only their parent or mentor, will it require IRB? Yes. The only circumstance where it would not need IRB is if the student tested it on themselves. Like their project last year, student created like a pogo stick type thing. They are the only one who tested it, right? Under different circumstances, on different surfaces, whatever. I'm making that up. There was something similar, whatever. You get the point. But if their dad got on that pogo stick that they designed, then that's going to require an IRB. You want to take the next one?
Yeah, James Zhao asks, can you apply with a project that is published in a journal? Yes, that's totally fine, and congrats on getting a publication if that applies to you. It's definitely not required for STS. We see students with published research perform well. We also see students who haven't published at all perform well. One thing I will say is if you do have a publication that you were submitting to STS, one, make sure that it abides by our formatting guidelines. Those research report guidelines are listed in our rules book that we've just walked through. So you'll want to make sure that it is the same. If something on the publication is different, like say it was a 2-column format where we only request 1 column, totally fine to go through and submit a version of the published paper for your STS project. Just let us know about those differences. That's the other thing I would say is that we have places in the application where you can tell us about previous publications. It's really important that you do so for many reasons, one of them being for our plagiarism screening. So we want to make sure that if you have a publication out there, we don't see that and go, oh my gosh, the student has plagiarized this published paper. We can actually adequately attribute that to you. So definitely make sure that's in there for that and many other reasons.
Very good. Travel diaries. Is stimulation of a human subject's environment to observe behavioral changes allowed? And does this need an IRB? Yeah, it's allowed. I mean, your IRB would have to tell you if it's okay ahead of time, but that would need IRB. So an example of a human project that would not require IRB, you sit by a stop sign and you watch to see how many people actually turn on their turn signal, right? Like you haven't manipulated the environment. You're just watching to see what's going on and tallying it up. So if you are manipulating the environment or you've created a condition that you want a human to respond to, the IRB needs to okay that. They might tell you, right? IRBs will tell you if you're going to need to collect informed consent from your participants. Sometimes they'll say you don't. If it's like the course of day-to-day action, sometimes they won't always require it. In some circumstances, they're going to tell you that you need to get an appearance release form, like if you're taking photographs of somebody and you're using those images. So that's where your IRB is going to give you guidance on that. So that's the kind of the reason. Want to take Surfside, Elaine?
Sure. If the project was done and entered into another competition, could it still be submitted for STS? That is totally fine by our rules. We get this question a lot related to research that was performed in the classroom, for instance, research that was again submitted for publication. It's as long as the project abides by, again, our specific rules. Remember that if you're submitting to us, you need to follow our rules first. Then that's totally fine. I will say some competitions do have rules about if you can submit to us, but on our end, that's totally okay.
Yeah. And I apologize, we skipped JW's question. Is this research limited to science only? Are math, computer engineering, or psychology research acceptable? They are acceptable. So no, it's not limited just to like life science fields. We accept all fields of STEM. If you check out the appendix that had the list of categories, you'll see. This year, we have actually introduced a new category. We really split one in half because we wanted to attract more students who are doing social science research to apply to STS. It's something that is really important to all of us. It requires a lot of skill, growing popularity. And so we want to make sure that, especially with big data, make sure those students know that they can enter. So that was kind of the thought behind that, like economics, that kind of thing. And so, yeah, check out the appendix, first appendix with the categories, and you'll see, and they all do well. So on our website, you can find our virtual public day website where there's a video and full bios that are written by our science writers on each student. And you can see there like the variety of projects is pretty cool. Great. Is a year of research better than 6 weeks of research, for instance? No. It really just depends. And again, STS is about the whole student, not just the research project. So a project that's been done for a year can have flaws. Project that's done for 6 weeks can have flaws. Our judges are pretty accepting of there's so much else in the application package. So we know that kind of thing happens, but yeah, so no, one is not really better than the other. And you'll see if you talk to any STS finalists that that is true for their experience as well. Does the student need to be a user on the IACUC protocol if they use tissues collected in their mentor's lab? It's a great question. No, you don't have to be a user on the IACUC. What you are going to need is to supply that IACUC and for your mentor to tell us in the recommendation that they gave this tissue for you under their protocol. So you can find more information about that within task 3. But if you're on the protocol, great. If not, and sometimes that is required. Sometimes that's like a university requirement and you'll see the student on there. But often we find that like students are using like tissue that, is a couple years old, kind of maybe before they joined the lab. And so that's kind of one reason why they may not be on the protocol. Any other questions, Elaine, that were in the form that are different than here?
Yeah, we definitely had a couple that I don't think have been represented here, so I'll go through a few of those. One, does STS take into account family responsibilities and extenuating circumstances that may have slightly affected a student's academic performance? Yes, absolutely. As Ali mentioned, this webinar has been very rules heavy. It's been very research heavy, but do remember that STS is a holistic competition. So we definitely want to hear, we have a whole section to talk about your activities, for instance, things that you have been involved in. If you had some specific event, or as you said, family responsibilities, extenuating circumstances, there are essays that you can use to talk a little bit more about how those have affected your life, have affected you during the application and research process. Basically, again, just be honest, provide us context for who you are and how the situations that you've been have affected the work that you're submitting to us. Allie, anything to add on that?
I mean, yeah, I think you said it. Usually when we do webinars, what we are trying to do is squash rumors that it's all about the science, because it truly is not. Being in the room so many times when the decisions are made, we can tell you for sure that context in student lives is very important.
Awesome. All right. My project was done completely on my own, and I didn't have a mentor other than my teacher at school, so not an RRI. If I'm already asking them for an educator recommendation, should I also ask them for a mentor recommendation? And do I even need a mentor recommendation if all my work was done independently? This is a great question. We get this one all the time. You can visit our FAQ to see how we've answered it there, but I'll say briefly that yes, you do need a mentor recommendation. And this applies to anyone, regardless of whether or not you worked with a mentor. And so again, that project recommendation should really be completed by the person who is most familiar with your research and can speak to your abilities as a scientist. So maybe you didn't have a mentor for this specific project, but you've had a mentor on a previous science project. That would be a great fit. In this case, yes, it could absolutely be your teacher if they're the one most familiar with your project. They can also use that form to be honest, to say the student was totally independent. I did not provide any mentorship whatsoever, but here's how I can speak to that student's abilities as a scientist. So they can definitely feel free to hack the form in that way. Another thing that we do recommend is if you're getting, say in this instance, a project and an educator recommendation from the same person, you have the ability to request up to 2. So again, 1 of each is required, but you can request 2 project recommendations and 2 educator recommendations. And for that educator recommendation especially, it doesn't just have to be a science teacher. Say your science teacher is doing the 1 educator recommendation, you could use the second one to have a teacher in a different discipline submit a recommendation, or it could even be someone like a boss, a coach, people along those lines who can also speak to your abilities as a learner, even if it didn't take place in a traditional classroom environment. So definitely, again, take a look at our FAQ and the rules book for more information on the recommendations and what's required of those. But yeah, totally fine for them, for your teacher to do both in that situation. All right, Allie, I think this is probably a good last one for you. How will this competition help me academically and get into college?
Yeah, fair question. The Science Talent Search is an institution. It's over 80 years old. Of our Nobel Prize winners that the society likes to recognize as coming from as alumni of our programs, they're all from STS. And it's pretty well known in high level academic circles. How will it help you with your academic future? We for the top 300 scholars, we have what relationships with many top colleges and offices of admission. We also email up to 15 college admissions offices of top 300 scholars choosing to let them know directly that you have been chosen. We also give you a certificate that is replicable that you can send to these schools to attach to your own application package, so they're hearing about it from 2 different ways. We also communicate the top 40 finalists to offices as well. And this can impact their decision making. We hear that all the time. So we hope that it is helpful to you in your collegiate journey. And other questions here that we can address quickly. And if we don't get to your question today, please do email us at sts@societyforscience.org, and we're happy to get back to you. Our team will. The question I will answer: if I'm building a computational model and I use resources on GitHub, is that allowed? I would cite it, but is that considered not good? That's fine. That's pretty common. Computer science projects, to use a library is that can be standard, but it depends on what you're doing, right? And the one thing you can't do with computer science is give us like tons and tons and tons of code. You got a page limit you got to stick to, and so that can be frustrating. So if you do want to cite cite it as a source, that's totally fine. Better to cite oversight than to undercite, right? That's like another pro tip for you. Are there any rules against using things such as rockets and model rocket fuels if they're on public sale and registered as safe? Do we require permits for flight? Check the hazardous materials section of our rules book on this one. If they are publicly available, then they're fine. You're going to need a risk assessment though for an adult to sign off on like how you handled the materials and how you were supervised and safety measures that were taken. Flight permits. This depends on the laws of your state. So I guess overseeing all of this is that yes, you have to follow our rules. You got to follow the law as well. And so that just probably depends on your state, but feel free to email that if you have a specific scenario and we can run that past other people on our rules committee. Alrighty, well, thank you all so much. We really appreciate your interest in this program. You're already a step ahead by learning with us tonight and putting us to the test on the rules. So tune in again. We're going to have some really fun sessions coming up later this fall, and we can't wait to see your application. We know how hard students work on their research and on this application as well during a very busy season of your lives. And we're very honored that you are choosing to share that with us, and you should be proud of putting yourself out there. So good luck. We look forward to seeing your entry soon.